The most interesting alternative to the standard way of playing Twilight Struggle is known as Sankt. While I am no expert on it, we will explore some key aspects of this playstyle and how you might implement it here today on Legendary Tactics. Sankt, which is also known as the Chinese style of play, is an intriguing alternative way to play and win Twilight Struggle. It certainly can surprise an opponent who is not ready for it, although it has inherent risks as it is considered to be quite an aggressive style. In and around 2016, players began to notice that a completely new style of play was emerging from some players that used Chinese characters as their usernames, and that this style was trouncing the traditional way to play. Chris Sankt Wei is seen as being one of the early and key proponents of Sankt, and that is where the name of the style derives from. What makes this playstyle so notable is how different it is from the so-called standard way to play. Let's take a look at some aspects that make it distinct. If I were to sum up the so-called Western approach, it can be described as more defensive, prioritizing map control with the eventual aim to win in final scoring. This includes valuing non-battleground countries to block access to regions and dominate country counts. In contrast, Sankt-style players prefer short-term point accumulation over long-term positioning, and avoid non-battlegrounds unless needed for battleground access or immediate domination, with the goal of getting an early auto-win or a win by war games event in the late war. For example, card events which provide victory points are prioritized over their operations points if possible. An example of this would be the US playing duck and cover for the event instead of the ops, or either player playing nuclear test ban for the event. Card events that provide your opponent with victory points are typically sent to space. Play should also generally revolve around getting mill-ops for yourself while denying your opponent opportunities to get them. This is a side effect of Sankt-style players focusing primarily on battlegrounds, which means coup targets will be limited by DEFCON restrictions. Also, any events that provide your opponent mill-ops should, as you might have guessed, be sent to the space race. In action round play, the Chinese style focuses heavily on the ops to expected VPs ratio, or in other words, the core philosophy is to maximize VP swings per op spent. This means, for instance, more aggressive play in Europe, particularly France, and investing heavily in the space race early on. So how does this translate onto the board? Chinese Twilight Struggle League champion Aragorn has estimated the expected VP value of battlegrounds across different regions. While the exact methodology is unclear, these numbers offer insight into how this playstyle assigns importance to regional battlegrounds. Interestingly, in Europe, the third battleground taken is worth anywhere from 6 to 10 victory points, while the fourth battleground is worth only about 2 victory points. And according to Aragorn, Europe control is worth 4,982,921,093 points, or, in other words, automatic victory. The takeaway here is that winning a third battleground in Europe is crucial, but pursuing a fourth too early may not be worth the ops. Soviet players may not rush to take France if Italy is strongly controlled, for example. In Asia, Aragorn estimates the value of battleground countries at about 5 victory points each, while Southeast Asian non-battlegrounds are worth 1 each due to the special scoring card, and are also important in going for domination. Thailand's strategic importance makes it the most important battleground in the region. In the Middle East, battlegrounds are estimated as being worth slightly less than in Asia, but still worth around 5 victory points each. The factors that reduce the value are that there is a higher risk of coups in the Middle East, and that domination in the Middle East scores less than Asia. Offsetting this are the bonus points that the OPEC card provides with control of key countries. In Central and South America, battlegrounds are worth about 5 victory points each, but come with a higher volatility because of the lower stability values, and are also more vulnerable to realignments. The same can be said for Africa, which has battlegrounds valued at 4 victory points each for the same reasons. Africa also suffers from some powerful attack events like South African unrest, which diminishes their value. The other major difference is in how non-battleground countries are viewed and treated. In Europe, the Mediterranean non-battlegrounds are not invested in by either side, as is typically the case, although Spain can be helpful in preserving access to France. The view of a Sankt-style USSR is that US control of the UK and eventually Canada makes it very hard to win domination in Europe, and a Marshall Plan event makes it even more so. So why even try? Only if the USSR is up 4-1 in battlegrounds would a Chinese-style player even make the attempt. use those ops elsewhere instead. In Asia, Malaysia and Afghanistan are important for the US to provide or maintain access to adjacent battlegrounds, but only one influence there is required for that purpose. If the Southeast Asian scoring card is coming soon, it can be worth investing in more countries like Indonesia, Laos, and the Philippines. That said, as Asia is costly to dominate with many cheap non-battlegrounds that can't be cooed or realigned, Chinese-style players often settle for an even score there while focusing ops elsewhere. In Central America, the only non-battleground worth investing in is Costa Rica to maintain access to Panama and to some extent South America. In the Middle East, Syria can be worth investing in for the USSR only if it secures domination. For the US, Lebanon is better than Jordan, but either should be used to maintain access to Israel for the US. For South America, Uruguay and Paraguay are the only non-battlegrounds worth looking at, purely because they protect or threaten battlegrounds. But overall, Chinese-style players see South America as being too ops-intensive to be much of a priority, and positions there are apt to be cut off without influence in Uruguay as insurance. In Africa, Botswana and Cameroon are important for the same reasons. The oft-overlooked Sudan can also be easily taken if it helps win the country count for scoring. There are also some differences in the philosophies of the setup. For instance, the USSR will take Poland as usual, reinforce East Germany, and play into Austria or Yugoslavia, as access to Italy is prioritized. The US setup depends on whether the Americans hold the Marshall Plan event. Whereas most US players fear the Suez Crisis or De Gaulle leads France event cards, the Sankt-style US player should use the Marshall Plan to dominate Europe immediately. After setting up with 3 influence in West Germany, 2 in Italy and 2 in France, the Marshall Plan headline event will place influence in West Germany, Italy, France, Turkey, the UK, and Canada, and either Greece or Spain. This secures control over key battlegrounds and limits the USSR's chances of breaking US dominance in Europe. Additionally, the extra UK influence protects special relationship, Canada helps enable NORAD, Turkey provides Middle East access, and Greece or Spain are only useful due to a lack of better options, although Spain can protect access to France, as mentioned earlier. Without the Marshall Plan in hand, it might be advisable to protect Italy with 4 influence. The reasoning is that 4 in Italy prevents the USSR from easily flipping it with a headline of socialist governments, followed by a first action round coup. Certainly, it makes it far from a sure thing. An influence could also be placed in France, which would both further the goal of locking it down and still retaining access to Italy if needed. However, they may still use the 4-3 setup in most cases, especially when the US holds socialist governments, which can be safely sent to space, or if they plan to headline Red Scare/Purge. Some Western players leave West Germany empty to avoid blockade issues. However, the Sankt-style player would not do this unless forced to because of a terrible opening hand. If that is the case, something like 3 in France and 1 in West Germany could work, so the USSR can't take West Germany in one move. And if you are fortunate enough to get it, holding Truman Doctrine until the right moment helps to punish the USSR for investing ops in West Germany. Losing Iran isn't seen as devastating, as the US can easily shift focus to South Korea and Thailand to block Asian domination and expand into Egypt and Libya to maintain a Middle East presence. Remember that this strategy prioritizes early European control and long-term Southeast Asian dominance over traditional Middle Eastern coups. Headline strategy will also be affected by this playstyle. Let's look at turn 1. The best headline for Sankt-style Soviet players is by far socialist governments, which can be followed by an immediate and strong coup of Italy. The Italy coup is preferred due to its higher VP impact. The Iran coup, while common, is more easily countered and doesn't provide as strong a return on investment. If the socialist government event reduces influence in Italy to 1, the best move might be to take it via direct influence placement on action round 1 instead of risking a coup. If there is no headline of socialist governments and the US setup gives Italy 3 influence and access to Italy from, say, France, the next best option is influence placement in both Israel and Afghanistan with a mere 2-op card, which forces the US to react on 2 fronts at once. A 4-op card could even be directed against West Germany or other key locations. Without control of Italy, France becomes the biggest turn 1 priority for either side due to its 6 VP swing potential in Europe. The Sankt-style Soviet Union should coup Italy right away and use favorable events to gain access to France as soon as possible. However, as the US, while France is still a priority, if the USSR doesn't coup Italy or otherwise have access, you can afford to delay a bit before securing it. The best headlines in the first turn for the Americans are Marshall Plan, which, as detailed earlier, provides immediate control of Europe, Containment, which provides extra ops and makes blockade less of a threat, and Captured Nazi Scientist, which advances the space race, a key goal. The Middle East scoring card can also be headlined because of the fact that the Iran coup is a likely first move by the USSR, and it gets it harmlessly out of the way, and Red Scare/Purge for obvious reasons. The Chinese approach to the space race in Twilight Struggle differs significantly from traditional Western strategy and gets the most attention. Western players primarily use it to discard bad events and avoid advancing too far early on to save room for mid-game spacing. In contrast, Chinese players aggressively push for space race victory points and abilities, treating it as a 7th region due to its scoring potential, and even spacing in their first action round if they feel it necessary. There are some good reasons for this approach. Advancing early can create a 6 to 10 victory point swing before the mid-war, making it a valuable source of points and is worth around the same as 2 dominations. Also, the discard held card ability is a major goal, especially for the USSR, as it compensates for losing the ability to space 2 op cards. For this reason, Captured Nazi Scientist should always be played for the event due to the importance of the space race. And care should be taken to avoid entering the mid-war with a lead of only 1 space on the space race, as this activates the 1 small step event, which would allow the opponent to easily leap ahead. Powerful recurring events like containment or nuclear subs should be removed via play rather than spaced, while weak early game events like Vietnam revolts and enemy war cards are ideal for spacing. This aggressive space race strategy helps secure long-term advantages and mitigate harmful event effects. Generally, as the Sankt-style player plays into regions as needed to affect an imminent scoring card, this style can mean playing at a geographical disadvantage in many cases, where there are regions where one falls greatly behind. Fortunately, there are some card events that can be used to safely get rid of the scoring cards of regions where you have fallen behind, like 5-Year Plan for the Soviets and Ask Not for the US. Hold these cards as long as necessary, as these cards can offset the positional disadvantage that might be caused by a focus on the space race, for example. And a note on a much debated event, NORAD. While most players value NORAD, Sankt-style players argue that it has too high an opportunity cost. First of all, you must invest in Canada, which requires quite a few ops. Second, you lose 3 ops from playing the event instead of using it for influence or coups. Third, it doesn't activate if DEFCON drops during the headline phase, which is common with events like Junta, We Will Bury You, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying. However, NORAD is too strong for the USSR to trigger, so if they draw it, they should space it instead. Finally, the China card should be held at all costs, as it not only denies your opponents a lot of operations points and a potential victory point, but it is your insurance against a potential DEFCON suicide. So to summarize, Chinese-style players prioritize short-term gains, the space race, and battleground control over long-term positioning. Europe is key early on, especially with aggressive play into France. Non-battlegrounds are only taken when necessary for immediate benefit. Chinese-style players play less around potential USSR coups than Western players. Adaptability is key. Strategy changes based on scoring cards, opponent's play, and the board state. A Sankt-style player's card philosophy revolves around maximizing strategic benefits over raw ops. While some events seem obviously strong or weak, deck dynamics, opponent style, and long-term impact often change their true value. It should also be said that this is not a style for beginners. The Sankt playstyle demands a deep understanding of game flow because it involves taking big risks on the board. To play this way effectively, you must know the deck well and be aware of what cards remain. For newer players, it's better to avoid overusing the space race since ops are too valuable early on. However, as you gain experience, strategically spacing cards for VPs becomes more viable, and players can dive deeper into this playstyle and see how they like it. So how does one counter a Chinese-style Sankt player if one is encountered? Firstly, be more aggressive in the space race than you normally would to prevent your opponent from being able to space 2 cards per turn and rush to the discard a held card bonus. If your opponent is the USSR, keep them in the kill zone, where they can't space 2-op cards but also can't discard a held card for as long as possible. Also, don't let them repeatedly gain the headline reveal or discard bonuses. Leading in space is ideal, but even if you're behind, don't ignore it. Always play Captured Nazi Scientist and One Small Step for the event to stay competitive. If your opponent is aggressively gaining VPs, you may need to prioritize VPs over board position. How aggressive you should be depends on the situation. If your opponent builds a big VP lead while you have a strong board, you must seek VPs to avoid an auto loss and reduce their lead below 7 VPs before the late war to avoid a loss by wargames. Red Scare/Purge is always a strong headline, but it's especially effective against a Sankt style player, as it limits the cards that can be sent to space, forcing them to use higher op cards to advance. And since the style depends on precise ops efficiency, this event throws off their calculations and makes it harder to execute their strategy. When playing against a Sankt-style Soviet, the USA should always play Bear Trap as an event on Action Round 7 or as a mid-war headline, rather than saving it for ops. This guarantees an Action Round 1 coup, which then ensures military ops, since Sankt-style players won't give easy opportunities for them. But don't use it in the late war, since Chinese-style Soviets can't space 2-op cards late game. Bear Trap lets them get rid of bad cards, so it's better to remove it from the deck early. CIA Created is also especially great against this style, so save it for the mid-war when it is more useful and most disruptive to a Chinese-style player. Sankt-style Soviets are more prone to DEFCON suicide risks until they reach Space 6 on the space race with its discard held card bonus. If the US draws CIA Created in the mid-war, use it as a headline to steal the Action Round 1 coup, since the main concern against Sankt is preventing an auto-victory or wargame win. Securing the first coup is more valuable at that point than worrying about late-war deck manipulation. Use events like 5-Year Plan or grain sales to Soviets to disrupt the Soviet player, even by forcing them to discard an American event card that may slow down their pace on the space race, or make them have to space a playable card instead of an undesirable one in order to keep their strategy moving. Either way, the Chinese or Sankt style offers a completely different way to play Twilight Struggle, and might suit the style of some players better than the traditional way, which keeps it interesting and fun for them. Players can experiment with these ideas and see how they do. Hopefully this little overview has been a good place to start. Thanks for watching. If this video was useful to you, please take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe down below. This is Legendary Tactics.